Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank you for this opportunity. Indeed, I would like to be a little bit provocative, but when I came, I thought the added value would be to be a bit systematic. And now I also have to invent something which should at least sound half provocative, but I'm doing my best. When the title transitions had to be connected with my agenda. Of course, I had to think about the 3 years. 3 years, which is so far the time of the Barroso II Commission in office, and exactly about 3 years ago, we went to a nice little college seminar in Bruges. That's where it all began. First of all, to develop the Europe 2020 strategy, which was the first kind of visible actions of the Barroso II Commission. And it focused on the long term. Maybe you can, if you really want to look back to this period a bit critically, why we focused on the long term, because we were quite confident, probably not complacent, but confident that the exit from the crisis is not very far, and what we really need to do is to see the next 10 years. That, I believe, also explains why in the employment policies we have been probably stronger what concerns the longer-term structural questions as opposed to the shorter-term cyclical issues, the response to the rise of unemployment as a result of the financial crisis, and particularly the specific euro area crisis, which I would say is still not finished. The reinforcement of our policies came a bit less than 1 year ago with the so-called employment package. The employment package was supposed to deliver on issues that were announced or promised in the Europe 2020 strategy, but also at the same time respond to the deepening crisis and somehow combine the elements which are necessary on the EU agenda and the member state employment agenda in the context of the crisis, but also in the context of the long-term transformation. And the aspect where it contributed most in the context of labour market transitions is the sectoral approach. The fact that we identified 3 key sectors where we expect, despite the crisis and despite the long-term impact of this crisis, we expect job growth, and we need to pursue an organized, orchestrated transformation. And these 3 sectors have been the ICT, the green, and the health and care. So these are, in fact, about the long-term challenges, one in technology, the other one in the environment, and the third one on demography. I think these 3 challenges shape not only the employment agenda, but very much the employment and social agenda of the EU. Since then, of course, there's been some progress in the implementation of these action plans in these 3 key sectors. In fact, just next week, together with Vice President Neelie Kroes and hopefully also President Barroso present in this historic event, we will launch a ground coalition for ICT jobs. There is a famous figure that there is on the horizon 700,000 ICT jobs which could be filled if the supply was there. Of course, the ICT question is not simply an issue of matching supply and demand. It brings a much more significant and deeper transformation of job profiles of the labour market, with added flexibility, added innovation potential, but also added potential for inclusiveness, to connect with many people who otherwise would be marginalized on the labour market and in society. The most important example is people with disabilities who receive new opportunities by a greater role of ICT in the economy and particularly in employment. On the question of the green jobs, it was obvious for us from the start that this is a transformation that is not simply about a sector, but it's about challenges, but at the same time opportunities for many sectors and many professions. It has to be a very holistic transformation. And of course, progress here is very difficult because it has to be embedded in the broader transformation of industry and other sectors. It also needs to be counted against the progress with sustainability targets and so on and so forth. The third sector, the health and care, was very much integrated into our last year campaign in 2012 on European Year for Active Aging and Solidarity Between the Generations, which dealt with many aspects of aging in the context of the labour market and also in the context of wider society. And I must say that if you compare the three, it always was stated that out of the three, it is this sector, the health and care, which has the greatest net potential to create jobs, while the other two probably has pluses and minuses, but we have to face them anyway, and we have to look at them positively if possible, because that creates the opportunities to exploit synergies and take advantage of them for the benefit of the economic stakeholders and the wider society. Now, how this change is orchestrated, how it is best managed, for all these sectors, I think the capacity to forecast the changing demand is absolutely fundamental, but this capacity to forecast the changing demand should not simply be a top-down exercise. It very much has to rely within member states, within regions, on the cooperation of the stakeholders, public as well as private. Employment services must play their role and cooperate better, working on this better possible cooperation between public and private employment services, but also the cooperation between the social partners have to play a very strong role. The social dialogue is not simply about developing expectations in this area, but also very much about managing the transition. That's why it's an additional reason why we need to see more social dialogue in the future as opposed to less. In fact, the forthcoming industrial relations report, which will be published in a few weeks' time, will also address some of the relevant connections here. When it's about skills, of course, it's also very important to connect better the education and the employment policies. That's what we are trying inside the Commission, but it's also very much important within the Member States. Incentives, for example, to learn more STEM subjects and have a focused effort for science, math, technology among disadvantaged communities, the children of marginalized communities, migrant background. This has been already in part of the efforts in the education portfolio of Mrs. Vassiliou. Let me finally just mention two other packages, because the employment package, I think from this perspective, the long-term transitions is the key document for us. But the youth employment package of December and the forthcoming social investment package are also about a combination of responding to the short-term crisis conditions, but at the same time the long-term transformation. And they also point to some more need of top-down action, particularly if you look at the youth employment package. I think it's clear that youth guarantees, which create some employment security for the young generation, will not be established through a laissez-faire a method. We need a top-down approach, agreement on the EU level, support from the EU budget for the implementation. And also the social investment package, which would be adopted this week, will also at least open a discussion about what more needs to be done on the EU level beyond learning from best examples, helping the weaker member states to take over the better practices, the better models of those where there's more stability, economic and social stability as well. So we have, as I explained, the long-term vision, which is more than an expectation. I believe we have the policy instrument, a stronger economic governance on the EU level, and the capacity to support this transformation with the EU financial instruments. Thank you.
Hold the applause for now. I want to go straight on to Daniel Gros, because you've not heard him today yet. He's the director of CEPS, renowned macroeconomist, but whether he's going to talk about macroeconomics, I just don't know.
Thanks. Indeed, I'm tempted to talk about macroeconomics. The title of this conference here is How to Make Change Happen. There's, of course, the question how policy can make change happen, but I think we have now seen on a very large scale how markets can make change happen. And this is not just change very short term, it's actually at least medium term. And what I mean by that are the very or rather long cycles in financial markets which push first employment into certain sectors and then push them out again. The prime example, if you want, is Spain. For 15 years or for at least 10 years, employment was pushed or attracted to the construction sector on a very large scale by very easy financing conditions and a housing bubble. And then after a bubble comes the bust, and now all these jobs are being lost very quickly, and change must happen. And I think that is not an isolated example. Actually, if you take Germany between 1990 and 1995, it had also had a construction boom. And then 10 years, not a bust, but a disinflation of its construction sector. So what you see is that we have these medium-term cycles, and they force us to look not only at what happens in the very long run, but also how we can make sure that the economy is not always off equilibrium. Either too much construction employment or too little, too much manufacturing, too little, and that is something that should make us think about what kind of strategy we have in mind. Should we only concentrate on the very long-term trends that the Commissioner rightly emphasized? Healthcare is certainly something that will go always in one direction almost. Should we not also take into account there are certain sectors which are subject to these ups and downs, which sometimes can have a medium-term perspective? And I think, at least at this juncture, there's a number of member countries where that should be perhaps the first priority in terms of employment policy.
Okay, thank you. And shooting the time, giving us more for discussion. I'll give the extra minute to Marina.
Maybe I don't have to use it. I at first give a similar answer as you do. Markets can make change happen. This is not an answer one expects from me. But what happens at the moment is that resource prices and commodity prices and energy prices have been tripling since the last decade. And first this was qualified as a boom or as a side product of speculation or whatever, but now even World Bank and other institutions that are not suspect of making mistakes in that direction see that as a thing to stay with us. And so we do have a structural change in the direction that maybe labor is becoming cheaper and resources are becoming more expensive. And that will cause different strategies on the side of employers. And it would be interesting for me how they, well, fit into the models that we have been talking about today. My second point, I've been spent my last 2 years for UNEP looking at a big hope of the environmentalists, namely decoupling resource use from economic growth. That's an old hope that is associated to old ideas of factor 5, factor 10, whatever. And we have been pursuing and looking at that very thoroughly over the whole past century, and globally and also regionally. And what you can tell is that there was a major decoupling between resource use and energy and economic growth. So economic growth in the past century increased by medicine numbers by factor 20-something, and resource use increased factor 7 to 9. So apparently there is decoupling, but the whole idea that we could, well, my second point is, if we look at the dynamics of resource use globally at current times, we can project that by 2050, we would use 3.5 to 4 times as much physically resources and energy to feed the globe if the trends that are now in place continue. That is, if emerging economies catch up with the consumption and resource use standards of the high-income industrial countries, which they actually are doing, which they are doing at a very fast speed. So this would mean that we would consume 4 times as much resources in 50 years, or in 40 years by now. This is not something the planet will deliver. And so we cannot change, and we shouldn't, I think, try to change convergence trends between developing countries and the high-income industrial countries. So all we can do is change our patterns. And that does mean we have to reduce our resource consumption. And this is not something we will achieve by decoupling. There we need strategies to do that. And there we need policies to do that. That's something that not markets would do for us. Last point, one of the strongest strategies that achieves this, that we are able to have productivity growth and technological development, but not an increasing use of natural resources, is reduction of working time. That's one of the most powerful. We have to redistribute productivity gains in time and not in money. If we redistribute it in money, we get increasing consumption. And so we undo the good effects of productivity growth. If we redistribute it in time, we get quality of life at the same standard of income, at the same consumption level, which is not so bad, I think, in our countries. Not always and everywhere, but it's also an inequality issue. That's a different issue. But on average, that should suffice. Thank you.
Thank you. Maria, you gain half a minute because further discipline has been exercised.
Okay, and I'll take it right off from where Marina stopped, namely with regard to where we need to head, or where we inevitably are going to head. The question I would like to raise is how we're going to arrive at this place. And currently we have 2 kind of narratives that can guide us in terms of choices. The first narrative is austerity. Austerity, if we continue, we will have less consumption, we will have less to redistribute, but it will be in a maybe less organized manner, and it will still be with the population hoping for the light at the end of the tunnel, because that's what austerity promises. It promises hard times today for better times tomorrow. So to a certain extent, it sounds slightly better than the narrative that Marina was just putting on the table, namely, you're going to consume less, and that's going to be forever. So there's no light on the tunnel. It's a different lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that we've been trying to achieve for decades, namely to be able to consume endlessly. And now we're being told to stop. So we have this battle of stop consuming or just stop consuming for a while, and then you can reconsume once again. However, if we go for the austerity, we will probably have a transition, we will have a change for less consumption, but it will, as I said, it will, the effects will be adversely distributed, while if we have one that is one of saying we're going to have to reconstruct the way that we produce, we consume, we work, we live, we redistribute, we can do it in maybe in a less adverse manner. The only problem is that the narrative is extremely difficult to sell to anybody. And the second question we then need to raise when we talk about narratives is who's the actor who's going to carry these narratives, okay? Who are the actors carrying the narrative of austerity, light at the end of the tunnel, and who are the new actors that are going to have to carry the narrative of let's consume less in the future? I'm not quite sure who wants to carry the message of less consumption, apart from the environmental activists who firmly believe it, but for the trade unions at least it's a we're talking about social partners and social dialogue. They are confronted with this, but it's a very difficult narrative to sell to members that actually expect to have higher wages and more consumption.
Such a disciplined panel, isn't it? So, Bart, you get an extra minute as well.
No, I'm going to take 10 minutes. I want to pick it up from a small seminar that we had a couple of months ago here under the title NEUJOBS in the Crisis. Not NEUJOBS in Crisis, but really what NEUJOBS meant for understanding the crisis. And I made some statements there which Iain then wrote up in a report, and he actually did it wrong, but on reflection he actually helped me to improve it. So I'm going to pick it up from there. Because really I think when we talk about policies there are three things that we need to think about when we influence policies. First of all, it's trends. Secondly, it's shocks, and thirdly, it's shifts. So trends are things like demographics, incremental innovation, social trends. They're long-term, they move along the supply and the demand curve. Short-term, you think that they shift demand and supply curve, but long-term, they don't. And if you actually start meddling around with it in policy, you very quickly figure out that trying to change trends is very costly and something that usually doesn't give you major results. Shocks are things like natural crises, like meteorites and asteroids, but also hurricanes, and also things like an economic crisis like we had in 2008 or 2009. They usually trigger governments to rapidly implement policies to absorb the shocks or the negative effects of those shocks. And as far as business cycles are concerned, we of course have some automatic stabilizers around it, and as a result you very easily are going to overreact. As to Maria's point, we know from the austerity policies that are being applied in the case of the European Union. And then we have trends, trends, shocks and shifts. Shifts comes to the heart of this project in NEUJOBS, because this is the heart of the socio-ecological transition. So here you talk about radical innovations, you talk about changes in energy and resource constraints, and here is where the government perhaps can help with policies, but in a very subtle way. So what is the subtle way? Well, let the markets work where they can, and where they don't, improve their working by way of competition policies, so that is one. Secondly, if there are temporary effects to market concentration, and when you talk about innovation, there certainly are temporary effects to concentration because of scale advantages, then grant those privileges temporarily to particular players, but be very transparent about it. So this is around innovation policies. And thirdly, compensate or facilitate the losers if you can afford it at least. There are always losers in this process, and if there is enough surplus that you get from the winners, then it may be a good way of spending your money to move the transition forward. This is actually where employment policies come in. And then fourthly, you can intervene to push the change in the supply and the demand in whatever direction you find desirable, but then be sure that if you speed up the process of transition, you're not slowing it down somewhere else. That's the point that I made earlier this afternoon, and that's where structural policies come in. So, if we now take the Commissioner's sector approaches to job creation, where do these things take in? And let me take my last minute to make some comments on that. Well, in the case of ICT jobs, I would say markets do most of the work here. There may be some structural policies needed here, and that is partly related to education that can help to create ICT skills. But most of all, there is a regulatory environment where actually most of the damage is done to ICT. More damaging than anything else across countries is that the regulatory framework doesn't really allow us to get all the benefits from IT. When it comes to green jobs, well, maybe there are some issues in terms of a lack of critical mass so that the prices don't fall rapidly enough. But I think the best thing that the government can do here is to play a major role as a customer. So it's a demand role for government to make sure that it asks for the kind of green products and services that it needs, and it will set the example and help to create the scale and bring the prices down. And then finally, healthcare, well, that's the sector, of course, where there are huge market failures, but there are inherent market failures because the demand for healthcare is unlimited and the supply is constrained. So the main thing to do there is to have productivity gains, because only these productivity gains will make it affordable in the longer term to create more healthcare services in the world. So here, it is where innovation policies come in. So in sum, I would say, yes, there is some role for policies in this environment, particularly when it comes to the shifts of the demand and the supply curve that are concerned, but are very subtle, and as I mentioned earlier this afternoon, they need to be applied in a way that actually the benefits that are gained from it are not going to stand in the way of the damage, or actually going to be ahead of the damages that can possibly be done by such policies.
And now we move into a discussion phase. Now, since the panel have been disciplined, there will probably be 5 or so minutes for individuals in the audience to come up with pithy questions. What I'll try to do is demonstrate the kind of question that I want you to ask. I don't want speeches. I want something very direct aimed at one of the panelists. So my first attempt to do this is to recall a speech that the Commissioner made to the ETUC recently, where he expressed concern about an EU, or perhaps an EMU, of two halves, with job-rich growth in probably the north, and jobless recession and the threat of social unrest probably in the south. So I'm going to pose this question to Daniel first and then to the Commissioner. Are we at risk of a schism in the European Union?
This is not a risk, this is a reality. This is pretty much unavoidable, but it represents the mirror image of exactly the opposite which we had in the period until 2007. During the boom, Germany had the employment problem, and Spain was the employment wonder. Now with a bust, it's just a mirror image. So that might not be, let's say, very nice to have, but that's the reality. If you don't get boom-bust cycles in financial markets under control, that's what you get. The damage has been done. The debt overhang exists. So I think all we can do now is damage limitation and try to reduce the pain as much as possible.
Right. A very pessimistic view. László?
How long time do we have? That was, at least in the presentation, quite provocative, because of course these two halves already probably exist, separated by the markets. Which countries are affected most by the CDS problem, and how it has already in the last 3 years separated Europe, creating practically also a political division out of an economic one, because this is already the major problem. Now, what exactly is unavoidable, of course, that can be discussed, because the question now is how long consequences this will have. I think there is a capacity, in fact a lot of possible instruments to limit the consequences of this, because if we don't start addressing this emerging divide, then the fallout can be massive, not only threatening the euro, but threatening potentially the European Union as such. And I don't want to quote now the Polish finance minister. You probably remember 18 months ago he was speaking in the ECOFIN about the possibility of war if these problems are not resolved. So I think it calls for a certain amount of caution whether we declare that this is just an unavoidable consequence of the previous 10 years, even if there was reckless borrowing and on the other hand reckless lending. We have to try to limit the consequences with financial means, economic means, institutional development, and also the employment and social interventions.
A second question, which I'm going to put initially to Bart and to Marina, is the following. The US recognised that it had a major energy supply problem, a geopolitical one. Its solution over the last 10 years or so has been, as you all know, to engage in the shale gas revolution. Shale gas has the further property that its carbon emissions are, I don't know, half those of dirty coal, maybe even less. It looks as though the market is solving the problem. Therefore, can we rely on the market to do more to solve climate change, Bart?
Wow. And you asked that question to a Dutchman who believes in the Dutch disease. The resource boom...
Also, the Dutch is surrounded by a dike, which will be at risk of... You're surrounded by dikes, which are at risk of being flooded.
Right. The shale gas revolution, as it is called in the United States, which I think is a huge hype and will ultimately disappoint those who really adhere to this hype, will have some significant changes to the global energy environment, particularly if the United States, and I think they will, is going to export energy. For the time being, this is a big fight between the domestic producers in the United States who don't want it to be exported because they want to have the competitive advantage, and those who want to make money on the exports. I think ultimately, with the US being a free trade, free market economy, they will export this. There are huge damages to this, partly because of the disease type effect that I just described. Even though the US, of course, is a much bigger economy than the Netherlands, there is the risk that energy booms very quickly generate very low returns because of the unlimited availability of this type of energy. In addition to that, there is the huge amount of environmental damage that will very quickly emerge once we are moving out of North Dakota into Pennsylvania and New York, where there are actually people living and who don't particularly like that there is this huge amount of damage being done to the environment. So we have another type of energy that we cannot leave entirely to the market, that will require innovations in order to make it sustainable in the longer term. It's not going to go away. You're not going to stop it. There will be other countries that will begin to try it. But again, I think it is a typical example where energy saving and environmental technology will be needed in order to make it manageable. So there's some room for the market, but there's definitely some room for government as well.
Maybe I think of the shale gas and shale oil even more as a hype than you do. I've just been reading an article by the American Energy Agency has downgraded the expectations of harvest from the existing wells by 45%, so compared to the estimates they had 2 months ago. So this is still a very shaky thing. It's a beautiful, it's a pretty beautiful hope, but neither do I believe that we will do that in Europe, nor do I believe that it will save America's energy problem. And it will again make America one of the major exporters in the energy sector in the world. I don't think this will happen. But of course it is, I mean, you have a double policy in the US. Before they said climate change doesn't happen, so we use our coal. Now they say climate change maybe is happening, so we are so nice to use our gas. So both answers are not really responsible in terms of world politics, to my mind.
My next question is going to go to László first and then to Maria. And it's in the focus we've heard from the Commissioner, and also in some of the discussion earlier today, there was a lot of talk about social investment. Social investment, unambiguously a good thing. We all know that. Is it just the latest fad and will fade away in about 5 years' time?
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully the point will be taken that this is about a shift, if I can borrow this term, not so much a shock and not necessarily just a trend. It should be a kind of shift to rebalance the social policies, to ensure that there is a sufficient emphasis to more forward-looking social spending. And when the member states and all others, local governments, regions and the EU, when they need to consider where to maintain spending and where to cut spending, because this is part of the agenda for everybody, they are increasingly able to measure what they can also save in the long run by spending in the short run. And this is the philosophy which we would like to install, and there will be many concrete examples from child poverty to homelessness in this document which comes out on Wednesday.
Maria?
Well, all fads leave some kind of trace somewhere, so it will leave a trace. I think that we have kind of these very fashionable ways of talking about what social policy are all about. You know, we talk about new risk, old risks, then we talk about social investment, then we talk about flexicurity, and they are kind of concepts that are interesting for scientific reasons and also for policy reasons, and so they kind of get some kind of hype and they become some kind of gravy trains as well, right? You can find us a lot of research on these things as well. So they kind of tend to go through a boom and bust period as well, but they always leave traces, and I think the idea of social investment in itself is a good one. I think it is about, namely, requalifying social policy as having, well, it's good in itself because it does actually provide equality, not always, but in most cases, but also that it is an investment and that there is some kind of return on it. Now, I do have a problem with only talking about social investment because I don't think that all social policy should actually have a return. And I do actually think we can do social policies without them actually having a financial return. But I also think it's very important that when they do have a financial return, that we actually do show it. So forth and back. I think it's, so I'm well, following this discussion with great interest to see where it's going to take us.
Let me just take this one stage further by asking Bart, if you had a choice between ICT investment and social investment, which would you take?
I think I would take social investment, and I'll tell you why. Because, as I said earlier, I think the market will take care of ICT investment. So I'm not too worried about the fact that companies will invest in ICT. Companies will also invest to some extent in social investment, but there is a positive spillover that needs to be generalized and where government can play a role. And if social investment includes things like education, like vocational education in particular, like helping organizational changes in public organizations, those are all good things from a policy perspective. So I'm not sure if I took your question right, but if you ask me from a policy perspective where I would invest, I would go for social investment.
Same question, Marina, on energy. If you were to choose between energy investment and social investment, where would you go? Making it work.
I think I also would go for social investment because I think that increasing social inequality will become such an obstacle for any reasonable environmental and energy policy that unless we are able to capture or to contain social inequality, we will lose our action space in policy making altogether. So that's, if it is an investment, you said in education, I say in something that delivers a lowering of inequality, I would go for the social investment.
Okay. It's a clear victory for social investment today. My next question, and then I'll come to the audience, so prepare yourselves, is about social polarization or employment polarization more specifically. I'll start by asking Maria this and then come to Daniel and to László, so that's three people to answer it. We've seen evidence presented to us today that the labour market is becoming more polarized, possibly hollowing out in the middle with the core of middle-skilled jobs, most vulnerable. Jobs at the bottom may be protected because they're not exposed to international trade. Jobs at the top, very much in demand. Is this, first, Daniel, a model you recognize as being accurate empirically? And if so, what do you see as the principal consequences in trying to change public policy to deal with it?
I think the evidence is not clear-cut, at least for me. And if I read the papers, there is some evidence in that direction, but you have to be careful whether that is a reflection of the changing composition of our workforce, because the workforce today is quite different from the workforce we had 20 years ago. We have a much higher proportion of university graduates. In a sense, the supply in the middle has increased a lot. and the people with very little, at least formal schooling, have also diminished. So maybe it's also a supply phenomenon that the middle ground has been pushing into the market too quickly relative to the demand which existed. Now, my feeling would be that at the same time now the demand is shifting. So I think of a broad manufacturing-based economy which can absorb a lot of medium-level educated people in normal working positions. If you go from there to a more fragmented economy with lots of services, or more services relatively, and services of a quite different level of sophistication and requirement in terms of skills, then I think what you described might come about, for the simple reason that's what we call the economics of superstars, that people with very high skills can apply them over a wider variety of the marketplace and therefore gain higher wages. Not sure what one can do against that.
Okay. Marina, can we do anything about it? Or should we do anything about it?
But I mean, if we try to take it in a long-term perspective, I think that what Marina was talking about, that the use of labor and how labor is shaped will change. It's not going to remain as it is today. Today we're seeing ICT making a shift within the labor market, making a shift and having effects on the middle level of the labor market. But if we go towards the socio-economic ecological transition, we can expect also to have new effects on the labor market again, and in terms of what we need in terms of skills, what we need. If we have a more decentralized economy, we might need more middle-range skills to deal with this, because we will have less centralized. So I don't think that, okay, it's very difficult to have these perspectives, but I don't think that we should take it as something that's inevitable, that things are going to look like this forever. So should we stop it? I don't think we can stop it. I mean, I think that, that's a little bit beyond. We can't force. I mean, we cannot force to say we cannot apply this new technology because it's going to hamper again the middle level of the labor market. So in those terms. On the other hand, I also think it's very important to say that we do already now have polarization within labor markets, but the way that these polarizations play out and the groups that they hit are very diverse across the European Union. Okay, they're not the same kind of publics that are being hit by polarization and dualization within the labor market, which shows that the effects, the outcome of this polarization is not inevitable. And there's a lot of policies that one can actually use to deal with these issues. Labor codes.
László, does social polarization or employment polarization trouble you?
Yes, the Commission on this question relies on the Eurofound agency in Dublin, which suggests that there is such a thing as polarization or the hollowing out effect in the labour market. If I want to simplify it a bit, I think it's predominantly connected with deindustrialization and the changing international division of labour. And I think we, of course, have to accept what is inevitable, but we can do and we must do something about it. Also because Europe is quite diverse. There are some countries which are not so much affected. And there is now, for various reasons, not only for this one, but this is my share in this enterprise, there is a serious commitment to a more forceful industrial policy in the EU. It's not only an EU feeling, there's a very similar feeling in the United States of America, and also there's a similar fear in Japan. So there is a kind of connecting agenda from this point of view because of the implications not only from the point of view of economic competitiveness and the capacity of wealth creation, but also the social stability and the social implications, domestic market demand and so on and so forth. So this is a very complex agenda, but I think this problem in the labour market is very much in the core of that.
Audience, you can ask a short question and you can address it to a maximum of 2 panelists. Mira. You have to be.
I have a question which is probably aimed at Marina and one other economist of his or her choice.
It's on.
Yeah, it's working. So we heard from Marina that we need to sort of stop increases in material standard of living and sort of use the productivity increases towards less working time. That's one of the principal challenges that Marina sees. And without commenting on that, I was reminded of what Hilma showed us in the morning about the German projections for labor force, which was that a combination of aging and decrease in labor supply combined with a lower number of hours usually worked by older people means, I think there was the estimate of 13 to 22% of reduction in labor hours in just 20 years, less than 20 years. So I think that's more than enough, Marina, to be what you're looking for. So maybe we don't. So my first question is, do we have anything to solve, or is the aging just a natural answer to what Marina is looking for? And if that's the case, are the policies aimed at actually motivating people to stay and working longer and work, a certain number of hours, actually detrimental to your objective, or should we just basically keep the pension ages low and not encourage old people to work too much, because that way we can get exactly where you would want us to be without any additional policies? Thank you.
Marina?
Well, take the example of Japan. Japan hasn't had any economic growth over the past 20 years. I'm not talking about Fukushima, yeah, that's a special event. But before this, and Japan had a quite substantial population decline, and Japan had a household income increase because the population declined with a less declining GDP. And in effect, the Japanese consumed about 30% per capita less materials and resources, which is not quite true for energy, unfortunately, but it's true for materials. So this is a good example, and Japan has shifted in the public opinion from a focus on income on a focus on good life. So they always do these annual well-being questionnaires, and the interesting thing is that there has been a shift towards quality of life. So obviously this is possible, yeah? I don't know what's going to happen to Japan now, but this is not so unreal. With the idea of keeping the pension age low and leaving all the work to the remaining people who also have to bear a few children so that we don't die out altogether is not such a good idea, I think. I think we need to have a more even distribution of working time among the members of our society. And that's something we have to achieve politically. It's not easy.
Yeah, 2 points. The huge increase in material use, which we expect over the 50 or so, even more years that you mentioned earlier, 90% of which would come from non-OECD countries. So we might try to reduce our material use, but that's going to have at most a marginal effect.
No, but because we are a model. Sorry, I interrupt. We are a model, and they try to achieve our standards. That's the trouble. We are, as actors, we're not so bad, but as model, we're terrible.
Okay, I don't believe that the Chinese household will consume less because he has a European or Japanese model in front of him or herself. They want to have a good life, and the TV and the car and so on, that requires some material use. Second point I wanted to make, I would expect actually to be labor inputs, perhaps at the appropriate prices, to be substitute for material input.
Well, sales of S-Class Mercedes are strongest in China at the moment. That's all I know. Bart, you'll have the last question. Microphone. And then the panelists will have a short chance to give their own reactions to everything.
Thank you, Iain. Raising the question about how can we make things happen, I think we need to address the instruments through which change can be, pursued at the EU level. So let's look at the carrot. The money has become very short. We have a historically low budget, thanks to David Cameron and some other people. Secondly, we are all aware of the limitations of EU policy coordination, let's say EU soft law, open method of coordination. So where does that bring us? Are we going to revive the European social dialogue as a policy instrument, even though it's not very lively for the moment? Are we going back to EU legislation, but then with what majorities? Or is there any hope that at some distant future a more limited number of member states are going to sit around a table through some enhanced or limited cooperation to pursue a more social agenda? What are the instruments that you're proposing to, go further with this?
Something tells me that's a question for you, Commissioner.
Well, as you know, the Commission is disappointed by the European Council decision what concerns the volume of the MFF, the next budget. But it's not a dramatic decrease if you look at it that it's anyway about 1% of the GDP, and for the largest single market of the world, of course, which is also a monetary union for most of the member states, of course, the reasonable budget would be much larger. In my view, that was probably one of the reasons why a relatively smaller budget was just easily accepted in a compromise at this stage, because there is at the same time an emerging discourse about fiscal capacity inside the monetary union. So the stabilization function of fiscal instruments would be possibly raised elsewhere in a not so distant future. So there is, of course, a different configuration of these instruments somehow emerging. It's not a shock. It's definitely a shift, possibly a trend that would leave a trace. EU law, in my view, is here to stay, and we have to enforce and reasonably add what is absolutely justified. But I think the Commission very successfully adopted the concept of the smart regulation, which is, I think, absolutely justified in a more diverse environment. What we introduced, and you haven't mentioned, is economic governance, which was just there in name before the crisis, before this Commission. And this is now a very serious procedure. The European semester, the third one now, from the annual growth survey to the country-specific recommendation, is a very, very close exercise, hopefully integrating more and more the social partners as well as the European Parliament, relying on the national reform programs, so becoming an instrument for creating coherence, policy coherence between portfolios, but also between various levels of government. So this, I believe, would play a more central role. And I'm saying that without underestimating the importance of the financial and the legislative instruments.
Back to the original question, how does change happen? I give each of the panelists now a minute or two to sum up what they think the messages that they'd like you to take away from their interpretation of it. We'll go in reverse order, so Bart, Marina, Daniel, and then back to László.
Okay, first on the job polarization, because I think that is an important issue, and then I'll come to the question on how to make the change happen. We have to be really careful not to get confused about the issues around job polarization. I think whatever research still needs to be done, it is clear that technology is a very important driver of this. Offshoring doesn't really play a big role. So let's stop with talking about this offshoring story. That doesn't really add a lot to the job polarization, and that's been true for the US and for Europe. Secondly, there's job polarization, but that doesn't mean that there's wage polarization. And this means actually that we can have institutions and policies that can avoid the worst effects of this job polarization that is taking place. So there's not much you can do about job polarization, but there's definitely something you can do about wage polarization, and that's where policies come in place. Thirdly, it's important not to confuse medium-level skills with routine tasks. It's not that in the future there's no need for medium-level skills. There will always be need for that. The problem is that a lot of these medium-level skills today are related to routine tasks, and that is what computers will definitely take over pretty much across the economy. So it's very, very important to keep that in mind. Now, On the policy side, what all this means, this is the interesting thing is that this economic crisis and this socio-ecological transition crisis that is ahead of us come about at the same time. So it's a great, and then on top of that we have the European policy crisis. So we can really ask ourselves the question now, what is it we should do with the policy framework? And I think we really have to ask ourselves the question, what is it that countries can do, and what is it what, if I may use that term, the federal level can do? And a lot of the policy that we're talking about make a lot more sense at regional level, whether that's country or even below the country level, than they make sense at the aggregate level. There's so much diversity there that it seems to me there is too much done at the federal level and too little left to the regional level. At the federal level, there's room for regulatory improvements, there's room for a single market, which are all kind of things that are helping, and now it's red, but I think I make my main point.
Well, I think early on today, it became very clear that if we need change to happen, we need to invest. So we need to find the money to invest to make the change happen.
Unfortunately, I'm in short supply for that, at least on the dimension required, if you think of this. I mean, I tend to withdraw a little bit from these strong policy statements and say we need to be a little bit more humble and see what is imposed on us anyway, and how we will react to what is imposed on us. And that these crises, Bart, all come at the same time, maybe is not a mistake of history, and maybe is not that just by chance. Yeah? There might be an internal linkage between them, and so crises are there to learn. And as Maria said, it's hard to sell a low consumption future, but it is easier to have it happen and then find good ways to handle it. And that's the way, the direction I would be thinking in.
Change happens all the time. So the question is not so much how to make change happen, but actually, if you want, how to react to changes in the environment, which could be long-term, trends the Commissioner mentioned, or short-term, like a financial crisis. And my feeling would be that policy perhaps should not try to really push always in one direction, but policy should prepare the economy for changes, especially unexpected changes, which are ahead of us anyway. So that would be my advice for policymakers. Make a system which is robust and flexible, and then it can take care of all the various shocks which are going to hit it anyway.
Perhaps one expression which I think connects with what has been said already by colleagues, to have a participatory process. Participation, I think, is very important. We can argue in certain cases, and I also did for top-down approach and other ways, finding what is the most relevant level of the decision-making on this or that issue, but what really ensures the sustainability and the good functioning is if those who are affected, the most important stakeholders, actually participate in the process, the design, the implementation, the evaluation, which is, I think, also a very important point if you look at the past period, when there have been some sometimes necessary and inevitable technocratic periods in a variety of countries. Of course, in a crisis, you can resort to this, but in the long term, we need to preserve the, so to speak, the level of civilization which the European nations have already reached, and is very much also about the social model, very much also about the participation in politics and policy.